to host today's webinar at Neary Press. We have a sort of revolving series of webinar hosts, if you will, and today I am quite fortunate to be it. Our webinar today is on updating psychotherapeutic practices with ancient indigenous wisdom. This is going to be quite an hour, and I'll make my, my introduction as brief as possible. I just want to say quickly a couple of words about Neary Press. If you're new to Neary Press and its webinars, this is a free service that, that this publishing company has engaged in for quite a number of years now. Neary Press started out back in the good old days producing books, workbooks, and things of that nature. And with the advent of technological advances of all sorts, has gotten involved in things like online training and webinars and all manners of other ways of disseminating knowledge. I am not a Neary employee, but I've had the chance to be in and around Neary Press for quite a number of years now, and can attest to it's constantly trying to find new ways to get as much information out to the public as possible. So with that comes the possibility of becoming a Neary Press, a Neary webinar sponsor. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but in all seriousness, I hope you will consider sponsoring Neary. In this day and age, doing these kinds of webinars and publishing books and online training takes a lot of work. The margins are really thin, and Neary, like many other publishers, frankly, can use all the help that it can get in terms of really getting this information out there. I like to say, it's a snowy day here in New England, so allow me to say that many of us are from the days when we had to walk 15 miles to school each way through the snow, and many of us remember the days when getting information like this was very difficult to come by. So let me just go through our learning objectives really quickly. You're going to see, number one, that participants will understand the native concept of original instructions. Will understand that advancement of the psychotherapeutic art does not require moving past the past, but rather incorporating it. And number three, understanding what a reverential and ritual-based practice can look like without mimicking unfamiliar cultural practices. By now, you are doubtless aware that you are in for a very special hour. I just want to add a couple of words, if I could, that if there's anything I've learned from watching Geral Blanchard present is that by the end of this hour, he is going to push you to the edge of your abilities and at the same time take you right back to the basics of human experience. And I want to mention that Neary Press has published a couple of his books, Ancient Ways and Ancient Ethics, which he will no doubt refer to. These books are really remarkable projects brought by Neary. Now, please remember, I'm going to make a quick pitch, but I am not a Neary employee. I really don't have any skin in this game. But I will say that the books are published in the form that they are because of the absolute courageousness of the originator of Neary Press, our dear and dearly departed friend, Steve Benji. And although most people would point to Steve, I'll also tell you that Joan Tabachnik has been a serious behind-the-scenes players in getting Geral's work out to a larger audience. So this is going to be something else altogether. I should mention also that if you want to buy either of these books, Ancient Ways or Ancient Ethics, you get a 20% discount. You can use the discount code that I can't see because of, oh yes, here it is, Mark 13. I think you can figure out how that works. It's Mark as in March 13 because the offer expires on March 13th, 2017. You can get them from the Neary bookstore to get 20% off or more on these books. And now let me show you a picture of Gerry and say that Gerry has been serving patients as a psychotherapist for 45 years. He's written 3 books on sexual abuse and trauma recovery. Every one of them is a gem, and 3 books on blending ancient wisdom, traditions, and indigenous knowledge into contemporary counseling settings. And so with that, Gerry, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you again and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So Tim, you can make Gerry the presenter.
Unfortunately, I still can't. Kristen
Okay.
can.
Hey, Gerry, hang in there, bud. I can see you speaking, and we'll get you online in just a second. I've said before, I've never seen the webinar without a technical glitch, so everything worked a moment ago. How's that now?
Testing.
Yeah, all right.
Perfect.
Got my voice, do you?
Indeed.
And do you have a photo up?
Yes, we do.
Wonderful.
Good
Well,
to go.
thanks again, David. I'm going to dive right in because we obviously don't have a lot of time, and I always have more to say than time permits. But just by way of introduction of this topic, I would say first off that I'm not Native American. So what I'm teaching is what I have witnessed and experienced with healers from around the world on many continents. But it is simply my perspective of things, and there's plenty of room for error. Two of the ways in which Native people, at least Native Americans, like to teach and heal individuals is through the use of storytelling, as well as the use of humor. And so I'll be doing that somewhat today, using both. And you'll see on the photo on the screen right there, I'm sitting with a group of healers, a couple of healers from Tanzania. We're on the ground, we're sharing stories, we're laughing together. And Louis Mail Madrona, who is a Lakota and Cherokee psychiatrist from Maine, where you're from, David, said transformation is unleashed by having the right story for the right occasion. Indigenous approaches to teaching and healing are the least coercive, the least dogmatic and doctrinaire of therapeutic approaches. They are much more accepting and inviting than Western approaches for addressing errant conduct. And the pragmatic side of this is that with this less threatening posture, we are more likely to foster patient buy-in and cooperation. Stories are a way of teaching that is intended to have the listener formulate their own ideas and conclusions about matters. It's not didactic in nature. Stories avoid any patronizing moralizations, which rarely work. And listening to stories, your clients will end up doing most of the work. So it's sort of like an AA meeting, taking what resonates with you and leaving the rest behind, but always fertilizing your brain in the process of growth. This storytelling approach is particularly effective with resistant patients, who many of us often deal with, and that can include persons convicted of interpersonal abuse crimes. While patients may be court-ordered to therapy, their sessions, however, should encourage a lot of their input and participation. So how do we facilitate or invite their participation? It boils down to, as Lewis said, having the right story for the right situation. And usually, an effective story is replete with subtle moral and ethical challenges. And they are often about lives of purpose and meaning, examples of courageous people in recovery, and reciprocal participation in society. And after all, it is reciprocity and relational thinking that is what indigenous societies emphasize more than anything else. In other words, give before expecting to receive. Now, I give thanks to Louis Mail Madrona for his encouragement and his endorsement of the book Ancient Ethics. And he told a story one time of a patient of his named Doug, who was very resistant to the work they were doing and was wondering about the importance or the relevance of storytelling. And they had a conversation and it went like this. First, his patient, Doug, said, "Okay, Louis, so what did that story mean?" And Louis, upon reflection, said, I played coy with him. I said, "It doesn't have one meaning. It means whatever it means to you." To which Doug replied, "Don't try and pull that therapy bullshit with me. Tell me what the story meant." "Well, if I tell you what it means," Louis replied, "maybe it won't mean that anymore." "Now what kind of bullshit is that?" Doug barked. Well, I guess it's shaman bullshit, Lewis replied. It's part of the storytelling rules. Explaining a story can only limit what it can do for you. That's from Lewis's book, Coyote Medicine. It's just as important, if we are to be healers, to be familiar with the appropriate use of humor, and importantly, have some humility in the work we do. I'm going to try and remove something from my screen right now so I can actually read my own slides. And Tim, are you still there, Tim?
Yep.
Okay. I'm trying to remove all the information on the right side of my screen.
You can put it back into reader mode if you click the same icons at the bottom.
Oh, okay, the reader mode.
The little book to the left. Yep. Or sorry, the left side, all the way left.
I'm gonna sit here and get tens.
The actual, your actual left.
Yep, it's not working. Oh well. Back to the importance of humor and humility. Among the Sufis and Native Americans, Thomas More said, I find the image of the fool as the persona of holiness. And what I like about humor in therapy is that it allows for a playful sallying with all kinds of different patients, whether they're perpetrators of crime, whether they're victims. But it opens people's eyes to new ideas, especially some of the nonsensical ideas and behaviors they might have engaged in when we use humor. As George Goodstriker, he's a Blackfoot elder from Alberta, says, humor is the WD-40 of healing. It's like using a little bit of sugar to help the medicine go down, the medicine of confrontations or carefrontations. It serves to drop resistance and opens minds, and importantly, without being shamed, we can often laugh at some of our nonsensical behavior. It prevents us, even as therapists, to be able from taking ourselves too seriously so that we can chuckle at ourselves and our professional foibles. So that fool that Thomas More was referring to, it could be considered the Heyoka in Native American culture. If you ever watched the television show Longmire, which is based on my old hometown of Sheridan, Wyoming, the Heyoka is the man who rides into town on the horse, sitting backwards in the saddle. And he has a message to deliver that's always given in a confusing fashion, where you have to figure out what's being said. And I think the Heyoka is the first of the paradoxical therapists. Yet he cuts through resistance by prescribing the very symptom that he wants to eliminate, all done with a smile. The native way prefers gentle prodding over any kind of psychological tasers. So in this very brief webinar, we're going to look at the role of the story. We'll add some humor. And I'm going to talk about ethical ways of making decisions that affect us and the patients we're serving. I'm going to ask you to use some of these methods to challenge many of the controversial issues we're confronted with these days, like the breakage model of psychopathology, where everything is a disorder or a dysfunction, versus the Buddhist psychology approach, which says that so many of our attempts at dealing with resolving suffering are just normal, functional behaviors. Perhaps your staff will want to question things like, do we continue to use and recommend SSRIs and SSNIs if we know that they're basically placebo effect, or they get their efficacy from placebos? And what if somebody's already on an SSRI and having results from it? Do we tell them now that what we know about the placebo effect and all of the side effects from these drugs? These are tough ethical questions. One of the questions I'm facing right now is, do we allow our profession to continue to treat opiate addictions through the prescription of addictive opiates like Suboxone? And I mentioned this to David earlier. I recently came back from the Psychedelic Therapy Symposium, and I'm left pondering how and when to initiate patient discussions about the use of plant medicines and psychedelic medications in the treatment of severe mental health issues, especially in light of their dramatic efficacy in treating PTSD, panic disorders, depression, and the almost immediate relief from heroin and other opiate addictions. So there are many different ways in we can look at ethics, different ethical approaches, and I'm going to start with the one that is in the news most every night these days. I call it Homer Simpson ethics, where people are arguing on the news about that my nonsense is better than your nonsense. You know, my fake news is more relevant than your alternate facts. And, you know, from some of the previous questions I just raised, you may conclude that much of what is done in the name of psychotherapy is sometimes nonsensical. Things we're forced to do by bad laws, ineffective laws that politicians have enacted. So in the professional field of sexual abuse treatment, many therapists and correctional officers still believe it is predominantly a sexual problem. Now, if we compared it to alcoholism, we'd certainly not consider that a problem of dehydration. So there are also some of us who might even believe that shaming and punishment still have a role in the treatment of many forms of abuse. But the opposite is the case, particularly with sexual abusers. Shaming breeds resistance, and it's been linked time and again as a causal factor in violence. And punishment has not been shown to reduce recidivism among sexual abusers. So we want to move away from the Homer Simpson ethics, but there's another way of looking at issues. Tom Mulyatsi from the NPR radio program Car Talk said, "If you don't think too good, try not to think too much." And I awakened not too many weeks ago when my alarm clock, my radio went off, and it was on an NPR station, and I heard this interviewer talking with an elementary school girl from Indiana. And she was talking about school and some of her favorite classes. And the interviewer said, "I bet you really like recess." And she said, "Well, yeah, I do." He said, "What do you like most about recess?" And she said, "Well, it's a time when I can either get my yoga mat out in the classroom, or I can go outside and sit on the earth and do some mindfulness work." And the interviewer obviously seemed a little confused. And he said, "What is mindfulness?" And the elementary school child said, "Well, it's thinking about our thinking. So that way I can make better decisions." So what we're talking about here is the importance of knowing how to think in resolving controversial issues in our profession. Normally we wait till graduate school before we learn about critical thinking and discernment. Now I would take you for a moment to New Mexico, to the Zuni way of knowing something, to come to a knowing. And they say that there are 5 ways of knowing something. The first is your geographic knowledge, which is the wisdom of local people and the land you've grown up on, from the Mother Earth. Another way of knowing is information or knowing that's passed on by teachers, acquaintances, plants and animals, all teachers. A third way of knowing is methodical thinking, in other words, deduction. A fourth approach is how we acquire knowledge from personal experience, which a philosopher might call phenomenology. And the fifth way is through intuiting, through dreams and visions, which is so very important in indigenous cultures, whether it's in North America, Africa, South America. It's noticeable everywhere. But in the business of psychotherapy, and with us all being licensed providers or certified in some way, we use what we call deontological ethics, which means we're feeling a duty or an obligation to comply with an external set of memorized rules that were generally prepared by a higher authority. like a licensing board. And last year, it was in October, I was out in Wyoming addressing the state conference on for social workers and psychotherapists, and I was asked to talk about my book, Ancient Ethics. And I spoke about Stephen Benji, who David just mentioned minutes ago, the former director of NERI, and how Steve wanted to accompany me one time to the Ecuadorian Amazon to witness some of what I write about. And so I had told a story in my last webinar of how Stephen and I had come across a man who was dying in the jungle, and I was commanded to heal him by a local shaman. Well, Stephen was there looking over my shoulder, cautioning me, saying, "Gerry, beware, be cautious of what you're doing here." And in front of the audience in Wyoming, I told them some of what I did to this man whose breath was just rattling as he laid there and he couldn't sit up. So we went to a sacred waterfall with the shaman, Stephen accompanying me. I was asked to get under the waterfall, stripped down naked with the shaman, to snort some black snuff up my nose, to sit down with the patient and swallow some psycho-integrator plant medicines with him and the shaman. They asked me to conduct some healing rituals. There were chants, sucking extractions, incantations, all kinds of extraordinarily unusual things that, of course, I was never prepared for at the university level. Well, long story short, the man healed. He rose up to his feet, he walked around, he smiled, and the next morning he started canoeing back to his home community, seeming no worse the wear after the severe head injury that he had encountered. And I saw him 6 months later in the jungle, feeling fine, feeling good. My role there was merely that of a carpenter of rituals. My job was to be a choreographer of healing events that tapped his belief system, not my belief system from my university training. So I asked the people in the audience in Wyoming to be critical of this story and pick it apart, finding all kinds of flaws and challenges to my ethical decision-making. And we took a break after I told the story, and when we came back, someone came up to me and said, "Gerry, I just wanted to let you know, several of the members of your licensing board have come, and they want to sit in and hear you talk." That was interesting. Wherever I've traveled, there's a word that I've heard used in every culture, even amongst tribal people. And that word is ay, 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 ay. And when I looked out in the audience, and there's my licensing board, I carried on with my story, and we had a marvelous discussion about the process of healing this man named Juan Fidel. Well, there's something that's called consequentialism. It's a form of ethics where it's the pragmatic code of ethics which asserts that the morality of an action should be judged solely by its consequences. In other words, a good outcome. So the question I grappled with my licensing board was, would it have been better for me to have turned my back on Juan Fidel and Stephen and I, walked away from it and allowed him to die? And I must say that was the same month that I gave the speech when my license came due, and it was approved. Now, after the conference, I wanted to go relax, so I headed toward the mountains of northwest Wyoming to spend some time hiking in grizzly bear country. And I stopped off at a Big Bear Sporting Goods first, because I needed some bear spray. Mine was old. I stopped to buy some bear spray before hiking into the Absaroka Mountains. And I asked the clerk, because I wasn't recognizing the brand, if this was an effective form of bear spray. And he said, "Gerry, if our grizzly spray doesn't work for you, just bring it back." Well, that's consequentialism. And there's another similar thinking out in the west of Wyoming. I would call the Code of the West, or Cowboy Ethics. And I don't mean here anything to be confused with one being a maverick. And by the way, in the background, I don't know, David, if I'm picking up on some of the noises in your office, I believe. But the approach is described by James Owen in his book Cowboy Ethics. And it can be regarded as a local brand of best practices. So it's being true to your own beliefs, principles, and experiences, and not confusing them with imposed rules. So this is the ability to make some tough decisions, like in the jungle, without looking over your shoulder, wondering what others are going to think or say. Now, rules infrequently compel people to unnecessarily change their ways, but sometimes we're left on our own to make tough decisions. You've heard people in different regions of the country, I'm sure, say, well, this is how we do things here. Courts will say that. Corrections departments in different parts of the country will have different approaches. Some states will have death penalties when others do not. Now, where I lived in Bighorn, Wyoming for years, just down the road on Mead Creek Road, was Buck Brannaman. He's the original horse whisperer from movie fame. And he's an astute spokesperson for this kind of approach. Someone I repeatedly quoted in Ancient Ethics. And from his background of childhood abuse and chaotic family alcoholism, Buck drew many applications for animals and people alike. He said, if you teach an animal a lesson by meanness or cruelty, don't be surprised if the animal remembers the meanness and the cruelty, but forgets the lesson. And boy, did we learn that as I worked at a prison in Wyoming. We brought wild horses into the prison to have them what they would call being broken, so they could be adopted out to homes. And many of the sex offenders and rapists at the prison were told to break the horses, and what we realized as we did this work together, that the horses broke the men. The men realized that their ways of intimidation and force and control were never effective. So today we're talking about what I would call a different approach from the prior ones, one that we call the Original Instructions, Indigenous Ethics. And this is a sacred posture toward all life, all beings, all of creation, the community of life. We are all equal and all connected, all brothers on this earth. Matakayasan, as the Lakota would say. We're all relatives. There is no separation between the technical and spiritual approaches to healing. And if we are to heal, we will do so in balance and in harmony. Native people strongly believe that rituals and ceremony carry people. They sort of transport people into new ways of thinking, to new developmental levels, and to new responsibilities in life, maybe from adolescence to adulthood. But rituals are a part of healing, and healing occurs in community, not just one-on-one, face-to-face for 50 minutes in an office. And all people, all of us are hungry for rituals. An Ojibwa Indian up in Manitoba once heard me talking about OCD, and he asked for an explanation. And upon hearing my description of this so-called disorder, he said to me, oh, well, that sounds like a ritual deficiency, but I'm not so sure I'd call it a disorder. Now, last month, in January, an angry, anxious, and depressed man from Europe contacted me, and he said he wasn't getting much relief from talk therapies in response to what he said was a hex that was implanted on him by some envious persons. He said his background was of Catholicism, and he asked me for ideas of any cultures that could help him. He said the last thing he wanted to do was be a part of an exorcism or anything like that, but he'd heard that the 3,000-year-old Mayan method of treating soul loss might be of help to him. Well, what I picked up on was his belief system, and I wanted to work with it. And, long story short, pretty soon I met him in Guatemala City, and from there we went up into the high country of Guatemala for some evidence-based treatment. In other words, a depossession cleansing ceremony. And there in Tecpan, Guatemala, he experienced a dramatic release of negative energies. And then he encountered a level of peacefulness that he hadn't experienced in years. And it was a beautiful thing to be a part of. He saw 2 different shamans in the mountains with 2 separate approaches, and it was the second one that was the sweeter of the 2 that really him. So rituals may in part describe some of the efficacy of EMDR. A custom, a ritual, a ceremony, a set of protocols that we're also familiar with. But it's important that whatever the protocols or the rituals we're employing, that they be used when a solid therapeutic relationship has been in place. That's the native way. And they are to be performed in a sacred way and in sacred space. All cultures, native cultures, emphasize the role of spirit. Bruce Lipton, the author of The Biology of Belief, said the latest science leads us to a worldview not unlike that held by the earliest civilizations, in which every material object in nature was thought to possess a spirit. So when I was in Guatemala, one of the female shamans I worked with said, "Gerry, tell me, what is your cosmovision?" Cosmovision. She wanted to know if my worldview matched her worldview, and together it might match that of our patient, and if so, more than likely than not, a cleansing ceremony would be effective, and indeed it was. By spirit, native people mean that animating force that's in all things, even a thought, which can put the placebo effect in motion. People instinctively tend to believe in invisible forces, whether it's a bacteria, a virus, something called Zoloft, maybe a guardian animal, maybe an angel, a special rock that person keeps in their pocket. But with a belief system that they subscribe to, much can be changed if we tap into it. And that's a fundamental shamanic tenet in every culture I visit on every continent. Not long ago in Peru, I witnessed a shamanic student having the twitching spine of an eel, an electric eel, inserted into his arm as a way to share the vibrational energy-changing power of the electric eel. All done with chickens running around and dogs running around, no alcohol for cleansing. And years later, this man is now a shamanic healer in Peru. It was the pop psychologist Wayne Dyer who once said, "You'll see it when you believe it." And right he was. So many of these invisible things we believe in have a force and a power that makes healings come true. And then there was that Lakota medicine man named Godfrey Chips, a real humble and humorous man. And he said his task as a shaman, he sort of, "I'm just the spirit's janitor," he said. "All I do is wipe the windows a little bit so you can see out for yourself." So all of indigenous healing, all of the original instructions talk about living in harmony with the rhythms of nature that gave rise to life. Thomas Moore again said, "To be in the presence of a sacred image is to be instructed, to know something one didn't know before, but simply to be the receiver of a transforming radiance." This Venda woman in South Africa took care of me while I was there, and one day while I was gone from my hut, on the sort of concrete entrance to my hut, she put hearts. And when I came back from a day in the field, the hearts led to the door of my hut. I was there with a group called Journey to the Heart. And look at her sacred radiance in her eyes. Look at her outstretched hands. Her life was one of service, and that's really what indigenous healing is about. Behind every psychological and behind every physical illness, there's disharmony. When we fall out of harmony, we become ill. Leslie Gray, who's a native psychologist in California, said, "The world of shamanism believes that health equals balanced relationships with all living things." That is so unlike abusive relationships. And from an indigenous worldview, very often this means that the problem is not the problem. So if I were to go to a Navajo shaman, and maybe I'm suffering from rheumatoid arthritis, it might be 2, 3, or more days before he ever asks me about joint pain. Before that, the focus of our attention is becoming more in harmony with ourselves, with our past, with the people around us, the animals, the world, even the universe we live in. And then after several days, the shaman might say, "Now, tell me about the pain of your arthritis," only to hear the patient say, "Well, right now I'm not really feeling any pain." It's coming back to a position of harmony with the world. That's what heals so many perpetrators of sexual crimes, so many victims who have lost their confidence in relationships. Carl Jung once said, "What we resist will persist." And that's an important maxim to remember. If we fight something, we get to keep it. So in the words of Black Wolf Jones in Ojibwa, he said, "Wear the world like a loose blanket," which implies let's not really try to bulldoze people into change or force feed our methods of therapy on them.
Hey, Gerry,
So
can I?
yes.
Oh, sorry, Gerry. Can I just step in and say we're going to be going over to questions in a few minutes. Folks, if you want to ask some questions, feel free. You can see the little question bar that you can click on to ask your questions. I just wanted to put it out there that we got a few more minutes. Let's go till 1:15. Does that sound good to you, Gerry?
Close to that, yes.
Okay, sure, yeah. Hey,
I'll talk
whatever works.
really fast. When we speak of medicine, we oftentimes think of Paxil, Cymbalta, Zyprexa, things of that sort. When I was in Zimbabwe one day, being a part of a water spirits healing ceremony, I had to eat a handful of termite dung and some ground Iboga root. And that was called medicine. But really, when we're talking medicine, we're talking about love, community, people, compassion, what Native Americans refer to as that being the good medicine. And by compassion, I'm not talking about empathy, sympathy, or even pity. Those are all somewhat disrespectful or even condescending. What we're talking about here is a desire to connect with people, see their pain, and be a part of lifting them from it, to remove that pain. Sometimes we use plant medicines like the root Iboga to relieve the pain of heroin cravings and heroin withdrawal. It's extraordinarily effective, much more so than Suboxone. So we're talking about love and compassion, and you see the words there of Karl Menninger. He knows that love, like St. Francis of Assisi said, is about something we receive by giving it away. To console, he said, was to console. And when I see shamans who've been away from their healing art for a few days, they get kind of out of sorts, and they have to go to work. Not because they're workaholics, not because they're chasing the buck, because it's when they have a heart filled with love, and they're targeting it towards someone else, they always feel better. Here I'm with a group of Hadzabe Bushmen in Tanzania, and this is how healing occurs there. We sit in circle around the transformative fire, and we understand that there's an exponential rise in power that comes from healing in groups. The number of people multiplied by itself equals the power in a healing circle, according to Jose Stevens. So having 2 people present is the equivalent of 4. Having 4 there is the equivalent of 16. I was off to a healing ceremony in the jungle of Ecuador one day, and these 2 little girls were going to guide me there. And we were going up these steps, earthen steps in the jungle, up to the healing lodge. And as they were walking in front of me, directing me there, I realized this is the medicine. I'm looking at it. It comes in the form of community. And I've always said, whenever I give talks, the importance of languaging. You know, Rupert Ross, the Crown Prosecutor from Northwest Ontario, said, to noun me is to know me. In other words, our language, whether it's from the DSM or from other sources, can make people feel like objects and can discount them sometimes.
True.
I've traveled to different parts of the country where there are what's called sex offender management boards. And I can't imagine going, let's say, to a marital therapy counseling convention and learning about managing your spouse or, you know, managing your wife. It's a whole different perspective we have towards certain groups of people. So we must be careful with our language, even when we talk about medicines. There are what we call psychedelic medicines that got a bad name for many years, and now on NPR, CBS, and other networks, they're talking about the hidden ingredients in some of these medicines that might help us from severe psychological problems. We call them in the indigenous world entheogens, or psychointegrators. Mystery. Again, I hear voices in the background.
I'm hearing that too. I don't know if Kristen or Tim have a hot mic thing happening. We've learned about the dangers of hot mics. Thanks. And Gerry, can we do a couple of questions in like 2 minutes? Is that okay?
Yep, 2.5 minutes.
Excellent. Thanks.
So we're talking about mystery, and we have to incorporate mystery into healing if indigenous healing methods are to work. Einstein said, you know, human beings, vegetables, or cosmic dust, we all dance to a mysterious tune, intuned with a in the distance by an invisible piper. If you went to the Ojibwa culture and they asked them what God means, they would say Gishi Manitou, or Father Sky, but literally translated, it translates to Great Spirit or Great Mystery. Mystery implies possibility. So sometimes with rituals and ceremony and the unknown, people see their doors open to possibilities they didn't know of before. This requires tapping into their belief system, using imagination, suggestion, and creating miracles. What was once regarded as supernatural healings oftentimes then can be supernatural healings. I think of Morris, a fellow I met up in northern Alaska, who said water is only cold if you think it's cold. He was from the Bear Clan, and after falling through the ice one day and being dangling from his snowmobile, wedged in to the metalwork of it for 3 hours, they pulled him out, took him by snowmobile to a plane, flew him to hospital. 5 hours later, he was just fine and discharged. He said, being a member of the Bear Clan, he decided he would just hibernate. And he knew that water was only cold if he thought it was cold. The doctor just shook her head. And then finally, as we close down now, we talk oftentimes in indigenous circles about energy movement and how having our bare feet touching on the ground literally puts us in touch with the electromagnetic energies of the earth, and not only heals physical ailments, but psychological ailments as well. So when I'm off and running, like here, to see an Achuar shaman in the Amazon, some people say, well, Gerry, you travel so much to these countries. Are you doing some missionary work? And what I say to them, well, sort of. It's a reverse missionary work, because I go to learn about the sacred and reverent healing methods of other people, to bring it back home for our edification and for workshops like this. Finally, I think of the Illinois Dr. Richard Gerber, who said, discoveries that we are making today are in fact reincarnational expressions of older spiritual knowledge which originated in ancient yet advanced civilizations. So a tribute right at the end here to Stephen Benji, who had the courage to travel with me, to live in all kinds of squalor, and to come home, I'm sure, with all kinds of special things in his body. And yet he believed in these ways of indigenous people and wanted them brought to life. Here you see him in the Amazon jungle with me. So with that, I turn it back to you, David, and for questions.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Geral. That was fantastic, as always. And at a personal level, I'm really glad you got the Morris Sage story in there, which is absolutely one of my all-time favorites. I have about 10 questions that I am dying to ask you, but we also got some really interesting questions from the audience, and I apologize for any of my bad pronunciation in advance. Ida, whose name I recognize from other webinars, asks an interesting question. Is evil a separate entity in indigenous culture? She says, I'm aware of Wendigo and some of the Kachinas being capable of hurting people. Is this a worldwide phenomenon? Your thoughts?
We have different ways of talking about being possessed or overcome by things such as the evil spirit of another person. In many cultures, they refer to it as soul loss, where the force, the powerful force of someone that I would oftentimes in therapy call an emotional vampire, just sucks the life out of us. They might be narcissistic people. They might run for high political office, but they are people who just have ill intent. And when we're close to them, it's almost like contagious. The Wendigo is a term often used in the north of North America. And it's like a spirit used to oftentimes frighten children, as I understand it, and to encourage good behavior. But it's also regarded as this spirit that can attach to a person. And so the gentleman from Europe who wanted to go to Guatemala with me wanted to be cleansed of that. And so he felt that the evil intentions of someone back home in his home country were still attached to him, and he needed help in a community sacred healing way to sort of be cleansed of that, to have it washed away. David?
Thank you very much. And just at a more personal level, I think even a Google search on the term Wendigo can be utterly fascinating for many of the reasons that you just mentioned, Gerry. On top of this, Michael also said, and I don't think, I think he says this in a very respectful way, your use of shaman, the word shaman, sounds more New Age or South American versus Northern medicine people. Any comment?
There's words that are regarded as somewhat synonymous one to the other. In North America, we talk about medicine people, medicine men, medicine women. But even here in North America, the term shaman is used. In Central America, South America, and Africa, I hear shaman used most commonly. Or when I get to Botswana or to Swaziland, the term sangoma is used. But really what they all mean are traditional healers. In Mexico, one might hear the word curanderismo, which is the term for folk medicine used in Central American countries. But they're all somewhat similar.
Excellent, thank you. And a little bit more closer to home question, I hope you don't mind. This one's from Robert saying, how do you describe your practice and methods, for example, to insurance companies?
Tersely, evasively. I still don't own a DSM, but I do go online and I use proper coding with insurance companies. I use the language of disorders to get people reimbursed, but I don't do it to pathologize them. And so it's a dance to be done, and I like to include the patients in knowing about this dance because I don't know them simply by the nouns assigned to them. And you know, David, you've heard me say this many times. If you were to go to an Anishinaabe people in Canada and look at their language, the Anishinaabe hardly have any nouns. So they can't noun you. They can't pathologize you as easily because their their language is heavily laden with verbs. I call that verbifying people. Because when we give people a label that says you're growing, you're changing, you're evolving, you're moving, you're becoming, or if people go through ceremony and ritual and are given a new name after coming back from vision quest or a fast, it says we're not frozen in any one term that crept its way into our file and our insurance records along the way. So in answer to the question, I have to be creative in that work.
Yeah, so you're living within the rules even as you're searching for the outcomes. And
that's called consequentialism.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So taking it from the webinar, for those of you that don't know Gerry, that was a classic Gerald Blanchard answer. And so in the interest of time, Gerry, let me ask you a question.
Okay.
In your book, Ancient Ways, in your first 1, 2, or 3 chapters, you describe sort of the start of healing, and it involves things like a healing journey to a sacred space where there might be an altar. There probably will be some kind of an altar. Call it what you will. And then I go to see my doctor or my dentist, and I park my car in a parking lot, and I walk in, and I see a coffee table, and I have to fill out a boring questionnaire, and then I look at the magazines, People, Red Book, Field and Stream, Better Homes and Gardens, and I say, certainly there's got to be a better way. And I guess sort of thinking about those of us who have offices in state office buildings and things of this nature, how can we incorporate these how can we turn our offices into healing spaces and have a ritual altar and turn even the process of going to treatment into a healing journey?
We can do that by leaving the office. We can do it by stepping outside and doing some of our work in nature. There might be a patio. There might be a hiking trail. I oftentimes take people to the wilderness areas of Montana and Wyoming for healing. But on a more practical level, David, I have seen many a coffee table become a sacred altar, where patients are encouraged to bring in treasured items and explain what they are. And with each session, they may bring another item and assemble it on that coffee table. And there might be a candle lit there that is lit at the beginning of a session and that they blow out when they feel they've had enough time in therapy. They may bring family members photographs or a sacred rock, something from their life experiences that has meaning and significance to them. So we don't need a formal altar, but I must say, last month when I was working in Guatemala, at I was at an ancient Mayan ruins site, actually at the ruins site, at a sacred altar that had been used thousands upon thousands of times to heal. And there we kneeled down, literally on an altar, with a fire ablaze, to capture the spirit of that land and that area. So that was quite a powerful altar in that instant.
Excellent. Thank you. We got a couple of, one thing I want to mention is you got a couple of thank yous and even an LOL from the people who asked questions. We got a couple of folks asking, will the slides be available? I want to draw your attention to, there's a place that you should be able to see that says handouts. And yes, the webinar will be made available. Tim or Kristen might be able to say a few more words about that, but I'll also have some information in my closing slides. And a very important question, Gerry, which is how do you spell Iboga, which I spell I-B-O-G-A. And I'm going to ask you, we've got only really brief question. How can we learn more about ibogaine or Iboga and its synthetic derivative ibogaine?
Oh, thanks for mentioning that, David. We're in a crucial time in America where we have just a terrible epidemic of heroin and opiate addiction. People are dying. They're having brain damage. I've had patients die. I've had people go to the emergency room of the hospital, one patient twice, just in the nick of time to save his life. And I introduced him to Iboga, I-B-O-G-A, and the derivative Ibogaine, which is illegal in the U.S. So to learn more about it, you might go to libertyroot.net, libertyroot.net. It's a treatment facility I use in Vancouver. Or you might get the book Ibogaine Explained by Peter Frank. But I can't say enough positive things about the power of this root medicine out of Africa to arrest heroin addiction in its tracks, stopping the cravings, and this is going to sound made up, in as little as 35 minutes, and stopping withdrawals in perhaps 18 hours. And all the while, you end up doing what in AA they might call a fourth or fifth step, where you do a searching and fearless moral inventory of your life, but you don't decide to do it. The Iboga has your life flashed before you almost like a movie. And it's scary, it's frightening, you have to look at your stuff, and when you come out of it, David, almost everyone is crying with tears of joy. It's like the reset button to life has been pushed. Sounds too much to believe, but I encourage people to look into this, because lives are on the line, our patients are dying, and getting them on an addictive drug like Suboxone is not the only answer. It buys some time until they can get a more effective form of treatment.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We are just about at the end of our time, and Tim, can you just make me the presenter for a moment? And okay, thank you very much. Should have done this a few moments back, but what I want to really emphasize is this webinar will be made available online. As you sign off, there will be I believe, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, there will be an evaluation for you to fill out. And that will also provide you with more information about getting free CEs. Global Institute for Forensic Research, otherwise known as GIFER, is the CE sponsor at this time. And if you have questions about anything having to do with this webinar, your person is Kristen Lobisch at KLOBISCH@neary.com. I think of it as Klobish at neary.com. So what I want to say as we draw this to a close is please feel free to keep in touch. Be sure to get the Neary Press free e-newsletter at nearypress.org. Which is coming into, it's almost 9 years now that we've been doing this. And also please consider becoming a sponsor. $98 for individuals, $250 for organizations. You will get a couple of free Neary Press books, as well as access to the CE credits and a guaranteed seat at every webinar. Again, you can go to the website at nearypress.org or email Kristen. Gerry, as always, your webinars and your trainings are the stuff of legend. Really appreciate your doing this with us today. And with this, I think that brings us straight up to our time today. Again, thanks to everyone for attending, and thank you again, Gerry and Neary Press, for making it possible.
Miigwech, thank you.
Yes, miigwech. Talk to you all soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye.